I'm a doctor, not a detective. I'm a doctor, not a magician.
Greetings. Last month, this public Facebook post, which you see on your screen, was put up by our good friend, Dr. Kelly Richardson. Oh, and by the way, before I get to the post, as well as the video that it linked to, I think it's important to acknowledge that our friend now identifies as Dr. Kelly Richardson. With that out of the way, let's get to this public Facebook post, which the good doctor put up. The post linked to an interesting YouTube video titled, "The Crafty Council Source Confirms Pastor Kelly Richardson and Debunks Them." In this video, I'd like to discuss that video a bit, and I think the good doctor will be pleased that we'll be taking a look at it, as last month he seemed to invite and encourage a response when he appeared on Sista E's show. Consider this clip.
Even for their own professor to literally say the very thing that I've been saying for years, that I didn't just say it was Hebrew on the pews, I said it's Geᶜez on the pews, right? Said that for years. They even had the video that they made videos off of. They made videos off of that, and now everyone's silent about it.
Yeah. Silent. He felt everyone has been silent on the topic, and he seems to have found that alleged silence curious. Now, as I just noted, that seems like an invitation to reply. You know, he's inviting us to reply to, his recent video on Geᶜez appearing on the Pews. And it seemed like he was inviting others to grapple with the subject. I mentioned that because I think it's important to make note of when we are invited to address a topic, just in case those who invited us forget that they did so. For example, last December, I shared this wonderful Facebook post from our friend over at the End of the World Ministries. You see, back on the 18th of December, he seemed to be clearly encouraging me to get back on the subject of the pews. And yet, just a week later, one got the impression that he might have forgotten about that bit of encouragement, as he was then complaining about those who kept the discussion on the pews going. And he called that discussion, or he called that topic, foolishness. So with that in mind, if anyone wishes to ask why I'm making this video on this subject, I would share that it's my understanding that our friend, the good Dr. Kelly Richardson over at We Woke Now, invited me to do so. And with that, let's now get to the relevant video. I'm going to pick it up at about the 1 minute 35 second mark and play slightly over 2.5 minutes. And of course, as always, I'll also post a link in the video description. I think that's important also to note. I always link to my sources so that my viewers can check them out. Not everyone does that. Whatever the case, the salient point of this clip, which you're about to see, is that the good doctor had proposed that Geᶜez characters appear on the pews, and in the documentary Cryptic Quest, Professor Ephraim Isaac likewise pointed to markings that resembled Geᶜez characters. So our friend, the good doctor, feels this vindicates his position. Ironically, however, as he plays a clip of me mentioning my past video on the sanctuary at First African Baptist Church, one finds allusions to a methodological problem which still remains in the good doctor's approach, and I'm under the impression that he might have missed that. Whatever the case, with that, here's the clip.
And when you look at Geᶜez and you go to those pews, you will see a combination of Geᶜez for some of the letters, as well as cursive Hebrew. You'll see that right there on the pews. And I brought it to the attention of the people down there.
As for the Geᶜez script, here's a quick analogy. This is from the website amharicquran.com. This sentence right here is Amharic. However, this sentence, on the other hand, is Arabic. It's written in the Geᶜez script, but it is Arabic. Therefore, assuming for the sake of hypothetical argument that there is coherent language in the pews, Pastor Richardson's reasoning that the text cannot be Arabic because some of the markings vaguely resemble Hebrew or Geᶜez characters it's a bad argument. And by the way, as was shown in my video on the church's sanctuary, all sorts of things can resemble Hebrew or Geᶜez characters, including markings in which neither Hebrew nor Geᶜez nor any other Semitic language is actually present. The point of that thought experiment was to show that Kelly Richardson's methodology can easily produce false positives.
So this is Dr. Ephraim Isaac. You could look him up on, just Google him, just to know who we're talking about before I show the documentary, right? He's a brother that was born in Ethiopia. He's an Ethiopian American. He went to Harvard University. He's a scholar of ancient Semitic languages and civilization and African/Ethiopian languages and religion. He is the director of the Institute of Semitic Studies at Princeton, New Jersey, and the chair of the board of the Ethiopian Peace and Development Center. Dr. Isaac, listen to what he holds now. He holds a bachelor's in divinity from Harvard Divinity, a PhD in Near Eastern languages. Let me say it again.
That's right up his alley. That's right up his alley.
PhD.
That's his lane.
There you go.
Ha, sa, ra, ri.
So all these letters are Ethiopian.
Yeah, that is Ethiopian.
Okay.
This is ha, this is sa.
Yeah.
And this could be na if it was straight like this.
Okay, while our friend the good doctor stated in February that we have been silent, the truth is that I addressed this a month before he even made his video. On your screen as a Facebook post I wrote in early January, exploring this very subject and noting some of the methodological problems with trying to infer language from markings merely resembling individual characters from a script employed by that language. You know, and this has sort of been a consistent theme. And this is also going to be the theme of this video. Now, I also covered this subject during a discussion on Faithful to God's channel on February 12th, and then I discussed it again slightly over a week later in a discussion with Orthodox Moor. And I'll share links to the relevant Facebook post and those two shows in the video description as well. Now, as a bit of a disclaimer, I want to make clear that this video is not intended as an objection or response to, to specifically Professor Ephraim Isaac. He was simply noting that there were markings that resembled Ge'ez characters.
I simply tried to say that some of the characters look Ethiopic.
That in itself is not a point of dispute. You know, the reality is that from my very first video on this subject, I myself readily conceded that the markings resembled different characters from a variety of scripts. However, from the start, I also noted that this is not sufficient for demonstrating the presence of language. Now, again, I'm not claiming that Professor Ephraim Isaac was claiming that discernible language is on the pews, but Kelly Richardson, on the other hand, does seem to argue that this somehow vindicates his claims of Ge'ez being on the pews. In fact, it's worth noting that when Ephraim Isaac was interviewed for the documentary Cryptic Quest, it was done years before I had made any video on this topic. Dr. Kelly, on the other hand, has spent over a year presenting himself as addressing my arguments, and therefore, he should be familiar with my actual position if he's attempting to address it. So I'm going to play a couple minutes from my original video, from my very first video on the subject of the pews, and then we'll get into some methodological points and explore a clip of Ephraim Isaac, which Dr. Richardson appealed to. Okay, so here's a clip from my first video. The presence of a marking which resembles a character employed in the script of a language is not by itself sufficient for demonstrating the presence of that language. The reason why it's important to keep that in mind is because, yes, there are certain markings on those pews that seem to resemble Hebrew cursive characters. However, they resemble all sorts of things. For example, the symbol that you currently see on your screen, or the marking that you currently see on your screen, to me, resembles a Greek omega. However, that is not enough that doesn't provide enough reason to think that the Greek language is present in these markings, that someone was writing in Greek. The fact that a marking resembles a Greek omega does not mean that the person who made the marking was writing in Greek, and the same applies to other languages. Yes, some of the characters might have somewhat resembled Hebrew cursive characters, but that in itself is not evidence of someone actually writing in Hebrew. Earlier, yes, some of the markings on those pews might resemble a Hebrew cursive character. Some of them might resemble a Greek character. Some of them might resemble an Arabic character. But the mere resemblance to a single character here or there does not establish that actual language is present. I don't see any discernible statements in Hebrew or Aramaic or Arabic or Greek or whatever. Now, let's offer an explanation for why resemblances to individual characters is insufficient for demonstrating the presence of language. Suppose you have a pew, and suppose on that pew you find this marking. Immediately, the question should be, what is that? Is it merely a shape? Or is it a Hebrew character? Or perhaps it's a Ge'ez character? Maybe it's a Latin character? Could it be a Greek character? The reality is that it resembles all of the above, and that alone should hint at the potential problem with inferring too much from markings resembling individual characters as if in a vacuum. See, this is precisely why I argued from the start that one should be attempting to show words and phrases, as that will provide the context which will allow us to determine what, if anything, might be intended by a given marking. For example, if that marking fell within a set of markings like this, we could say that looks like the Hebrew phrase Shema Yisrael in the Phoenician or Paleo-Hebrew script specifically, and therefore the marking in question would be a Phoenician or Paleo-Hebrew ayin. However, if it was among a set of markings like this, that instead looks like the Ge'ez word meble, which means food, and from that we might infer that the marking could have been a Ge'ez ayin. However, if instead the marking fell amongst a set of markings like this, we would conclude that it was a Latin O employed as part of an English phrase. And if it fell amongst these sorts of markings, we would instead conclude that it was intended as a number, as a numeral, specifically the 0. And if it fell amongst these sorts of markings, we could conclude that it was instead, likely intended as a circle, as one shape in a series of different shapes, not as a letter or number, and not as a letter from any script. The point of this analogy is that context is the key to identifying a marking, and this is precisely why we need phrases, sentences, to conclude that language is present. Without the context provided by words and phrases, appealing merely to resemblances to individual characters can all too easily result in false positives, and you should see that from this analogy. You can have something that might have been intended as a 0 and you're interpreting it as, an ayin from the Phoenician script, or vice versa, And with that in mind, let's now look at a clip of Professor Ephraim Isaac, which Dr. Richardson appealed to, which he felt was significant.
This is ha, this is sa.
Yeah.
Okay, here's an important question. Do you recognize which pew is being examined there? Does it look familiar to you? It's actually this pew. And to make this more clear, I'll pull it back and rotate it right side up. Do you recognize the pew now? It was actually the one that Benaiah Israel examined last November. And this is also the same pew that came up in the Boom Church panel discussion when the appeals to David Bunis were first unveiled. So let's rotate this pew 90 degrees to the left and zoom in. This is the angle that Benaiah Israel was looking at it from. This is how Benaiah Israel looked at it. And he proposed that these two horseshoe-shaped markings were actually two instances of the cursive Hebrew chet, which is to say the 8th character of the Hebrew alphabet, or aleph-bet. And he was quite confident that that's what those markings were. To illustrate this, to illustrate his confidence, let's return to that Boom Church panel discussion, which took place back on November 22nd. This is a Facebook post which reproduces that discussion. So let's pick up where Benaiah Israel is saying that it's obvious what those markings are.
Right. And for me, there were some letters that were just obvious. I'm not to throw shade, but that you don't have a doctor's degree to know that letter that goes like that is right there. You know what I mean? It's like simple stuff, right? And then they come out, oh, that's not that letter. Oh no, that's not the, in stuff like that. I do the SMH for that, but we put it out there so people can look at the letters, compare to look at the pews and see if they can see the letters. And for a lot of that stuff, it is very obvious. Right?
Mm-hmm. Having noted Benaiah's interpretation of those particular markings, let's now rotate the pew 180 degrees and pull it back slightly. It turns out that when David Bunis looked at the pew from this angle, with highlights on it, I should add, he thought it looked a bit like a single character, a Hebrew sin in the Ashuri script. Some viewers may recall that in a video from last December, I offered speculation that David Bunis, proposing the word Yisrael for the relevant pew, was likely based on the markings resembling two characters, Sin and Lamed, and the mind sort of filling in the rest. Now, when I got to correspond with Bunis, I ran that by him, and he confirmed that to his recollection, that basically was the reasoning employed. That said, getting back to the pew, as was just shown, Ephraim Isaac noted that these markings looked like Ge'ez characters, when it was turned this way. It looked like specifically the Ge'ez characters Sha and Ha. Keeping that in mind, I would submit that they also look like the letters, used in English, specifically W and U. Like, how would you distinguish between the Ge'ez Shat and the Ge'ez Ha, or a W and a U, from the English alphabet? So too, they just as much resemble the Greek letters Omega and Upsilon. And keeping that in mind, let's rotate it 180 degrees yet again. Now looking at it from this angle, remember, keep in mind that when it was facing the opposite direction, it was compared to the Ge'ez characters Ha and Sa. Well, if those characters were possible, then turned this way, we could say they resemble the Ge'ez characters Ba and Ta. So too, it might be said they resemble the Latin characters, the lowercase n and m. And speaking of Latin characters, if we rotate it 90 degrees to the left, the characters now resemble the Latin characters E and C. Now, we've rotated this pew a variety of different ways, and that these sorts of experiments begs the question, which way is the right side up? The honest answer is that without the context which would be provided by a coherent phrase, there's really no way of saying for certain which way is the right way to rotate it. Moreover, the markings resemble a variety of different characters from Ge'ez, Hebrew, Latin, and even, Greek characters. This discussion on the pews has always been one about methodology, but unfortunately, our friend the good doctor over at We Woke Now has never really grappled with the methodological questions. Nonetheless, there is a glaring question here, and that question is this, and this is the question I would pose to the good doctor. Via what methodology does Dr. Kelly conclude that these specific markings are Ge'ez rather than Hebrew or Latin or Greek? It should be obvious at this point that simply asking that a person defer to a scholar who seemed to say something that he likes is long gone. Those days are behind us. Those are the days of the appeal to Bunis. Because, at this point, even the good doctor reserves the right to disagree with various scholars. I really look forward to the comments of others, especially responses from our right honorable friend, Dr. Kelly Richardson, as well as any of his followers and supporters. I only ask that any such replies try to address the methodological questions. I think, it's been about 1.5 years that we've been having these back and forths, and I think it's time that someone really get into the methodological points which have been raised from the very beginning. So I took a peek at Dr. Kelly Richardson's recent show titled Coming Up with Lent, and I noticed there was a brief portion therein where he discusses the proper pronunciation of shalom. He thinks the proper pronunciation is shalawam, and he claims that there was no O vocalization in Hebrew prior to the 9th century. So I thought I'd make a quick video responding to that. So I'm going to play a brief clip from his show where he discusses that, and we're going to pick it up at slightly after the 24-minute mark. Here, listen to this.
That word shalom. None of our ancestors back in the biblical times said shalom. Why? Because the O sound did not exist in ancient Hebrew. That O sound was added. That O sound was added around the 15th, 16th century, and you'll see like the vowel movement. The really push of these different vowels interpolating so many languages. Right in the 9th century, right, the original Masoretic points, right, the colon va, right, or the colon or colon va. Right, colon va, that's the vowel letter. Colon is the actual vowel sound. Vowel, right? And that letter, that vowel actually made an ah sound, not an o sound. So many will try to mock and say, hey, what is shalom? Actually, shalom is the ancient pronunciation. Shalom is not the ancient pronunciation. Why? Because there was no o sound prior to the 9th century in the Hebrew language. But anyway.
Okay, so the easy response to this claim has been available on the internet for well over a decade. And that is to note that we have ancient transliterations of Hebrew words and Hebrew names that definitely long predate the 9th century. For example, regarding the word shalom, that actually is part of the name Abshalom. You know, that's a name in the Bible, Abshalom. We have transliterations of that name, ancient transliterations, so we can see how ancient Hebrew speakers thought that word or that name is pronounced, and by extension, it would tell us how they thought the word shalom was pronounced. And so, too, we can also look at the word Abaddon, which gets, you can find it in the book of Job, that word. It means destruction, and you can find it transliterated in the book of Revelation. So let's take a look at some examples of this. First quick example, this is the 3rd Psalm as it appears in the Septuagint, but let me note that this is not just any copy of the Septuagint. Rather, this is from Codex Sinaiticus, or Sinaiticus, as some say, per the Greek pronunciation. And we found the name Abshalom transliterated here. It's transliterated as Abesalom. And what's most important is what would be the O sound in Hebrew is captured with an omega. It's transliterated with an omega. Now, if there was no O sound in Hebrew, why would this ancient transliteration render it with an omega? That's an important question that I'd like to pose to our good friend, Dr. Kelly. And here's a quick second example. This is from Revelation 9:11, 9th chapter of Revelation, 11th verse, where it mentions Apollyon and says that his name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and the O vocalization is captured again by a transliteration employing an omega. So once again, we have the same question for our good friend, the gentle doctor. If there was no O vocalization in Hebrew prior to the 9th century, why do we see ancient transliterations, which predate the 9th century by centuries, employing O vocalizations in their transliterations? I mean, that's an interesting question, isn't it? And of course, we could go to other names. I mean, the name of Jacob, for example, and there's other names available as well. But the point is that Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, at least certainly forms of Hebrew that existed well before the 9th century, had vocalizations that the Lashawan Qadash system doesn't recognize. So I'm about to close this video here, but I want to close by saying that the system of pronunciation known as Lashawan Qadash is a modern innovation. And if Dr. Kelly Richardson is unimpressed with what's been presented here, I would invite him to offer a counterweight in the form of ancient transliterations. So, for example, what does he know of? What's the oldest source he knows of to imply that the word shalom is pronounced shalawam? What's the earliest source to take that root? Can he find anything prior to the 20th century? And certainly anything going as far back as, Codex Sinaiticus or earlier. I would love to see what he has, but I must confess, I don't think he's going to produce anything like that. And so if he doesn't, we have to say the ancient evidence is on our side and not on the side of the proponents of Lashawan Qadash. On that note, I hope everyone found this brief video interesting and fun. And as always, I look forward to the comments of others. God bless.
You ain't see that 125 years ago. We ain't hear people saying certain things, shalom. We ain't hear a lot of stuff, but we hearing it now. We're seeing certain things now. I just want to know if some of the stuff is built on a lie. I ride with them that this law Qadash language is make-believe, Pastor Kelly. Shalom, wasn't nobody saying that 200 years ago. Yeah, y'all are nothing but liars to me, and I'm going to check everything out. So now they talking about shalom. And how you a doctor with a dissertation? How you a scholar and you can't peep something and know that this is not right and exact?